We want to welcome you to this episode of our Digilatcha podcasting. If you recall, Digilatcha was developed by the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative to inspire creativity and enable educators to network in real time and share professional learning experiences that ensure equity, access, and opportunity for all in our remote rural areas, regardless of their zip code. All learners, children and adults alike, have individual needs and must be provided equitable opportunities for learning that enable them to succeed both academically and socially. Now, in this time of COVID and even before, we have virtual learning experiences going on, which means there's more access to our students through other means. But even without virtual learning, there's always a need for ethical behavior and a code of ethics that educators should follow anytime they're working with our students. So I feel very fortunate and very excited and pleased today that we have two experts in developing and implementing code of ethics. With us today, we have Anne-Marie Fenton, the Director of Rules Management and Educator Assessment with the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, and Troy Hutchins, the Senior Policy Advisor for the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification. And since that's such a long name, I'm going to call it NASDAQ from here on in. So welcome to you both and excited. So let's start, just introduce yourselves and tell us what you do and your work and how you're associated with NASDAQ and these model codes.
Thank you. I'll begin. Many thanks first to the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative for this invitation and for your commitment and leadership to this topic of educator ethics, this critically important topic. To those listening, we thank you for that and hope the time you devote here is well spent, causing you to think further about this critical area and also to foster conversations in your own context and across contexts about professional decision-making in our complex profession. This is important to us, and I know it is important to you as well as educators and members of this complex profession. My name again is Anne-Marie Fenton. I'm with the Georgia Professional Standards Commission, the state agency that oversees certification, educator preparation, ethics, and assessment for Georgia. And as Robert said, I'm Director of Rules Management and Educator Assessment for the agency. We are coming to you today really representing the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification. Robert, you did that very well, and I'll do it again.
It was a mouthful.
Under the leadership of Dr. Philip Rogers, who's the Executive Director of NASDAQ, and NASDAQ's Special Committee, the National Council for the Advancement of Educator Ethics. I want to tell you a little bit about NASDAQ, Robert, if I may, just to set that context. I think it's important for our conversation. NASDAQ is dedicated to providing leadership and support to those responsible for the preparation, certification or licensure, ethical and professional practice, employment, and continuing professional development of educators. Since 1928, and yes, I said since 1928, NASDAQ has served as a professional membership organization representing state departments of education and professional standards boards, or commissions that are responsible for the preparation, licensure, and discipline of P-12 educational personnel. You may also be interested to know that jurisdictional members include all 50 states of NASDAQ, the District of Columbia, the Department of Defense Education Activity, Guam, and the Canadian province of Ontario. So all states belong to NASDAQ. And associate members do include education preparation providers, P-12 school districts, educational organizations, and others. And I know that's a lot of information, but it's important that you understand the role that NASDAQ has and why it is involved in this world of professional decision making. So thank you again, Robert, for that moment and for this invitation today.
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. And just to let you know, we just signed our second contract as an associate member with KVEC with NASDAQ. So
Wonderful.
We're in there with you as well. So good morning to you and Troy. Good afternoon, Troy. Let's hear
Yeah, hi there. Troy Hutchins. I was a teacher for 16 years in both public and private institutions. And then I was in higher ed, where I was a faculty member and a director within a teacher ed program within a college of education. For another 15 years after that, I've done quite a bit of research in this area of educator ethics. and have been a subject matter expert in a lot of different resources and national committees and so on, including I was a subject matter expert for the development of the model code of ethics for educators. I've also been an expert witness in court cases dealing with teacher sexual misconduct and test fraud and other things as well. So that's a bit of my background, and that's kind of what I bring to the table.
So it's exciting to hear about the expertise from both of you. So this is going to be a great conversation as we talk about ethics. And in one of my former roles, teacher ethics was part of our work, which brings me to my first question. I know in Kentucky we had ethics for our educators, other states do too. So why were a model code of ethics needed? Why were they developed?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and I think we need to make some distinctions. First of all, there are codes of conduct that virtually every state has. In every state utilizes a code of conduct to really govern a teacher's and an educator's license, and so anytime that is crossed or there's a violation of that, there could be an action taken on a license. Now, in different states, including Kentucky, it's often called a code of ethics, but in reality, it's a code of conduct. And let me give you an example. I happen to have Kentucky's code of ethics right here, and there's a line in there that said this establishes the standards for Kentucky certified school personnel and establishes that violation of the code may be grounds for revocation or suspension, right, of teacher certification. Anything that frames up standards in a way where there's a consequence is actually a code of ethics, or excuse me, a code of conduct, not a code of ethics. Whereas codes of ethics are completely different. And going all the way back, the American Medical Association developed a code of ethics in 1847. The American Bar Association for Attorneys was in 1908, and American Nurses Association was 1950. The American Psychological Association 1954. So there's this long history of a code of ethics, and codes of ethics have a different purpose. They prompt, they guide, they inform the complexities that practitioners face on a regular basis, and that's really critical. Because those complexities are very nuanced and they're in the gray. They're not necessarily crossing the red. So it's Charlotte Danielson, for example, who many of us are familiar with, a researcher in 1996 said that educators make up to 3,000 non-trivial decisions over the course of a workday. And even if it's 300 and not 3,000, just think about how complex and nuanced those are. And that's well before, that's in this gray area, this murky terrain, well before a line is crossed. And so codes of conduct deal with the line being crossed, and codes of ethics deal with all of that gray area that we need to navigate. So a code of ethics gives us a common vernacular, a common lexicon, a common language, so that people can rely upon the values of our profession in making decisions, as opposed to our personal morality and personal experiences. If all we have is our own personal experiences and morality to guide our decision making, we'll never have professional norms that we all agree upon, because we all have different codes of morality, but we need a common code of ethics, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, and that has been a perfect lesson for me, because I often had conduct and ethics as the same.
Yeah.
And so that explanation really helped to guide my thinking in that direction. So it
Well,
does.
and even, yeah, and Robert, if I can even expound on that just a little bit more. So even if there is decision making in that gray area, that's very possible it might lead to a violation, right, of a code of conduct or a standard within a code of conduct. But those are two different frameworks, but they're closely intertwined. And in fact, one of the things that I love to say is that even misconduct, when it does cross a red line, it is not just an event, it's a process. And that process is often in the gray, and it's often well-meaning, and it's often rooted in the disposition of caring compassion. So it's not always malicious. And that's something we have to think about too. So professional ethics asks the questions of, what could possibly go wrong? What are the risks involved in this particular situation? How best should we mentor students It doesn't say that we should or should not. It says how best should we do it so we can protect ourselves as well as the students and their profession. And then it gives us the common language to be able to do that.
The code of ethics then allows us to be more reflective in our decision making and in
It,
developing any kind of conduct, possibly.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And not just, and I think reflective is a big piece that's often in the hustle bustle of our profession of making 3,000 decisions over
Right.
a day. It's very difficult to look outside of the initial decision that we're making. But if it can be a bit more intuitive and a bit more of the DNA of who we are, like it is in other professions, then all of a sudden we can navigate that murky terrain much easier, and we can do it together and collectively. In other words, it gives us a sense of agency and ownership and empowerment as a profession, as our profession.
So let's say we have all these codes of conduct and all these codes of ethics. And Anne Marie, I know you're wanting to say something, but think about this question as we move forward: is how, and thinking about all these different nuances of how all these states are developing, how were these created then? So Anne Marie, go ahead with your statement. Then it's
That's okay. I can go ahead and jump into the next question. What I was going to add to Troy's remarks and yours as well, Robert, is regarding why it was developed and what is the need. When you think about being a former classroom teacher and someone who's prepared teachers in our state, when you think about the intentionality that we place on on content knowledge and subject matter expertise, dispositions, so many critical areas, what an intentional focus on ethics does is it gives us, and the model code of ethics for educators does, that I know we're getting into, it gives us principles to have those conversations that Troy mentioned. It gives us the common language, if you will, to have conversations and place that intentionality, that focus in not only educator preparation and preparing our candidates for either teacher leadership, what service roles, whatever their roles are, but also for practitioners in the field doing the work. And we're not just talking about teachers, we're talking paraprofessionals, teachers, administrators who now have this guide they can use to foster those conversations.
And that's so important too, because as you said, all the folks, the paraprofessionals, teachers, leadership, at any given time, you have an adult having to make a decision on the spot with up to 120 kids at one time, or more at any given point, at different levels of educational things that they may need. So those quick decisions, and sometimes that quick decision may not have been the best decision, but it seemed so. So this is important. So let's jump to that next question then.
Sure.
Just why were they created and how were they created? How did you get all these different states involved? You said NASDAQ has 50 states plus. So that's huge. So how did this happen?
Thank you, Robert. What we did is there's a long history of the development toward a model code of ethics for educators reaching back for decades and laying some groundwork that eventually led up to this work. And then in 2013, the executive board formed a steering committee to look at, okay, so is it now time to begin this work of development of a model code of ethics for educators for the profession, by the profession? And all felt, yes, it is time. And of course, NASDAQ gets input from its partners, its representatives. We had many conversations. And so the way this came about is that the partners, educational organizations that undergird the profession of education, were invited to nominate someone, a practitioner, and that was important, to serve on a model code of ethics development committee. And they spent over a year working on this. And I'm talking educational organizations. I don't mind mentioning there's over 10 who were involved, and we've had, you're looking at the National Education Association, the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, National Association of Secondary School Principals. There's so many, the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, the Association of Teacher Educators, and several others. So we wanted to make sure it was representative of the work of these educational organizations as
Okay.
far as them recommending practitioners in various roles. And so a very diverse and representative committee was assembled to do this work. And again, over a year they spent, and then it was released for public comment in 2014. And we received a lot of different public comment. What I really like is that that public comment was used to inform changes. And then the executive board did vote to adopt the Model Code of Ethics for Educators as it was presented to them in June of 2015. So it was a process, but again, built on much of the rich years of NASDAQ in leading up to this work. Troy, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, and I the acronym NASDAQ is being used a lot, but I think we need to really clarify that the Model Code of Ethics for Educators was not developed by NASDAQ. Right. So NASDAQ facilitated the process, brought in all the educational organizations. They then nominated practicing educators, and those educators being paraprofessionals, teachers, principals, superintendents, to gather together and do the initial work on that. And so. NASDAQ again is the one that facilitated the process. I've heard it a number of times, not necessarily today, saying this is the NASDAQ Code of Ethics. It's not. In fact, it's the first unified professional code of ethics in our country. And in fact, one of the organizations that Anne Marie mentioned was the NEA. Well, the NEA actually developed a code of ethics in the 1970s, and that's often taught in our teacher ed program. But if you look at it, every one of the standards starts with an educator shall not. And so that's more of a code of conduct instead of a code of ethics. And so they recognized that and jumped on board. So again, it's a collective effort, and it involved practitioners from all over the country in the initial development.
And I know members of all these organizations that you mentioned, and you talk about a powerhouse of brain work. And they're developing a model code for their own profession, which I find to be powerful too. So thinking about all these states and all these organizations, are all states currently using the model code?
Not at all. And that's where there's a difference between our profession and other professions. So the American Psychological Association developed a code of ethics in the 1950s, but they have one umbrella organization, the APA. Mm-hmm. And so, but in education, we have state jurisdictions, we have county jurisdictions, we have regional service center jurisdictions, we have school district jurisdictions, and then sometimes we even have independent school jurisdictions with charter schools or private schools. And so all of a sudden that's kind of a game changer. So in order to, and then besides that, every jurisdiction has its own political structure in terms of how to adopt or how to implement. So there are some states like North Dakota, for example, and Hawaii and a few others that have actually, their professional standards board have authority to make adoptions and to create policy. And so they've adopted the Model Code of Ethics for Educators. In other states, for example, in Iowa, it was decided that all the movement would come from the teacher education programs. So all 30 plus teacher education programs in all the universities have adopted the Model Code and implemented it into their curriculum. We have a lot of districts. I work closely with a county in California that under their superintendent's office, the county superintendent's office, there is 23 school districts. Well, every administrator that's going through certification has to be prepared in the Model Code of Ethics for Educators in order to receive their license. And that's 23 districts. So it's being handled differently throughout the country. Because again, we have so many different ways of doing things. Some states are not able to legislatively adopt any kind of a major thing like that. It would take legislative action to be able to do that. It might take law, it might take statute. So maybe the word for those states would be implement as opposed to adopt.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Or endorse, that it is a credible resource is also, of course, an option too. And Troy, to also build on what you said, I think that it is important to also think about that's the beauty of the model code, that it is so flexible in ways that it can be implemented. It's not a program to apply. It's not a one-stop shop. It is a process, and it is really intended to get folks talking and talking in advance and to help avoid missteps, but also to have those meaningful dialogue that can make us a better profession.
So you mentioned that there are other professions that have their own code as their
Mhm.
standard. And so you look at this model code for educators, in your opinions, then what would make this model code be the bar for educator ethics?
Well, that's a real that's a heavy question. In fact, it might even be a loaded question.
No,
Um,
no, no load, no
yeah,
load.
yeah. So here's the
No
thing.
judgments here.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something that sounds very counterintuitive, and that is this: it is my belief that the model code of ethics for educators, and here's my copy, it's all written up with notes all over it, um, and there's only 86 standards, so and so it's about 9 pages, 5 principles and 86 standards, and 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 if you look at other codes of ethics. Uh, they're 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 all powerful in that they're 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 taught at the pre-service level. They're a part of the licensure level. It's a part of the continued licensure level of the profession, and so it has this sense of common understanding. So everybody is speaking that language, and there's an expectation of how to approach things. In our profession, we haven't got to that point. And so often what we like to do is to assume the model code of ethics for educators is the solution. It's the answer. That whenever we face a situation, we just pull this off the shelf, we open it up and we look at,
Yeah,
we try to find an index and tell us how to do it. Tell me how to do this. And that's not the purpose of this. So the actual, back to your initial question, why is this the bar? The counterintuitive answer is that I don't believe it is.
okay,
I think the solution resides with the practitioners, not with this. And so the practitioners have the agency, the ownership, the power, and the experience. They just don't have the words. They haven't been given
great point.
permission to have those difficult conversations. And so a code of ethics allows a profession, gives it the language to have the difficult conversations at the pre-service level with 18, 19-year-olds who are going to be teachers, all the way through those people who have been in the field for 30, 40 years. And we've never had those words before. And without the words, without the language, we can't deconstruct the barriers to creating the professional norms so that we're all on the same page in how we approach situations like other professions do. So back to your question, I think, yes, I think this is really important, but like all codes of ethics in all professions, the solution resides with the practitioners, not
I've
the
heard you
actual
speak
code.
on this. I've heard you speak on this a couple of times, and I would have to say the words you just used are so impactful. Maybe you've said them before, and I haven't heard them as well as I have today. But just that intrinsic ownership of my behavior, and then be able to reflect it and have the words that I need to reflect on my own behavior. That's pretty powerful, Troy. I'm glad you
Yeah,
brought that up.
and Robert, if I can give you an example that I've experienced, I was doing a workshop in California on the model code of ethics for educators, and an administrator came up to me, a school principal, and he said something really I thought was pretty profound. He said, until an educator crosses a line, that red line, and maybe transgresses policy or some other kind of conduct absolute, he said, I always felt uncomfortable approaching them and saying, be careful how you're dealing with this parent, because it's a very risky situation, because then it becomes my personal and professional values versus yours. And the teacher could always come back and say, oh no, I've got a rationale for doing that, and we have no common language in which to have the discussion. And he said, now I've got the professional norms so that the teachers and I can have a collegial discussion about what we all believe, not just what you believe or what I believe. And I think that's a really powerful example of that. And once we do that and we're on the same page, it's a very impactful experience, because I think by and large, educators want to share their complexities. They want to talk about how nuanced these things are.
Mhm.
They're seeking how other people would respond, but they don't really have the language to even ask those questions. And now we do.
That's awesome. I know, being an educator for 36 years myself, having this conversation and how I talk with others, I'm going to be thinking about, I'm going to reread those. And how after today's podcast, how that impacts how I'm thinking about my conversations with others.
And Robert, I really would like for us to think about that for a moment. These are written, they're very aspirational, but yet something that is embraced by the profession. So therein is the beauty to reread those and think, what does that really mean for me in my own context? What could it mean? What do I need to be mindful of? So what you've just said is a wonderful strategy in how to use the code. Is one way, is a great way, is just simply pick it up and read it. And you don't have to do all those standards at one time. And it's meant to cover a vast amount of area so that it does help to inform. But again, a great strategy, Robert, to use is pick it up and read it and then talk about it. And
that's very important for our listeners to hear, Anne-Marie, because what you just said, many folks who have read it are now probably rethinking about how this pertains to me. So let's go to the next point based on what you said, Anne-Marie.
Yes.
Rereading it, and you all mentioned that there are some universities that are bringing this in their pre-service programs and training up. Some districts have adopted, some states are looking at this, not as their code of ethics, but as their model code for norms, etc. So if I'm sitting here and I don't have access to this and I've not seen this, how do I get access? How do I learn about these? How do I get trained in these? Where do I find all these resources? And I know it's a long question, but just go. How do I get this information in my head?
Thank you, Robert, for that opportunity to share more information about what to do with this, kind of the so what. First of all, there are several tools that live on the NASDAQ website, and that's NASDAQ, NASDTEC.org. .net, I'm sorry, NASDAQ.net. So you'll want to first go there. In the top corner on the right or across the band ribbon, you'll see Model Code of Ethics for Educators. That is a great place to start. It not only houses the code, but it also has some framing documents about why we have the code, many of the things that we've talked about today. It talks about the history of the code. Most importantly, it has some additional resources to use. The National Council for the Advancement of Educator Ethics, which was established by NASDAQ's Executive Committee in 2015, is really focused on not only using the code and helping to build those resources, because we're all in the same business in education. So no matter who's working on it and contributing, that's absolutely wonderful. And we want to provide those resources to folks so that they can find those. But there are webcasts that the National Council has put together. Troy has a wonderful blog series that's very informative, and those are also posted there on the web. A great place to start, too, is simply watching, it's about 4 or 5 minutes, a Model Code of Ethics for Educators video. And what you'll see there are many of the faces who helped to develop the Model Code of Ethics for Educators, talking about the why, talking about why is this important to our profession and what does it do. What's most exciting is that we are currently working on a second video, but this is really aimed at just your question, Robert, and that's the use. And this will have an accompanying guidebook of ways to consider pedagogical strategies, additional resources, ways to foster those conversations that that we hope is an outcome of our time here together, to go away and to think about these things. That we are looking for completing by the end of this year. And that is a collaboration of NASDAQ, the National Council for the Advancement of Educator Ethics, and several voices contributing to it through vetting, but also through conversations, and much of which is informed. Troy is our subject matter expert on that, and he is really helping to inform that work. So we are thrilled to have his voice in there as well, and very excited about that collaborative project. And I think that resource will be a big plus. But again, it's only one resource. It's not, the be-all, end-all. So we do invite people to pick up the code and read it, as you said, and then think about ways that they can implement it. So again, it's not just a so here's something I've got to go do, or here's one more thing coming at us, but a really authentic dialogue prompt.
Marie, you said something that's so important. Folks are always looking for that magic bullet, and you both
Right.
mentioned that this is not the end all, but it's a powerful resource that you can take back and use with your schools and your districts and your states.
Absolutely.
And so I really appreciate what you said. Troy, any final thoughts other than
Yeah,
what you
I just one of the interesting things about the model code of ethics for educators, and I'm doing a lot of writing. I'm writing a manuscript right now, and I'm really kind of decoding the code standard by standard, and I've got a ton of case studies I'm using to weave in for each of the standards, and I'm learning so much just by going over it again and again and again. And one of the things I'm learning is that it really aims to not just be aspirational, a goal-centered thing, but it also aims to provide a defensible course of action, so that it's not about choosing the right decision, but the most appropriate decision given the situation, the nuance, and the situational variables that are occurring in the moment. And that kind of navigation is so critical that a code of conduct can't always quite measure. And one other piece to this is that every single standard in the model code actually starts with an action verb. And that's important because it's not just something we all believe, it's something that we do. And if we do it, that means that our actions will be completely defensible. And that's really important. If our actions are defensible, then as a profession, we're establishing and creating this standard of care, the standard of practice that we all are a part of. And that's really, really important. So again, there's a lot of facets to this, and it's not just a feel-good document. It's way beyond that. And I say that because we have a lot of feel-good documents in education, because our profession is really, it's centered in acting in the best interest of not just kids, but the public in general. And so, but this is something that we believe that we do. And if we do it, then our actions are defensible.
I think I'm gonna put on my wall in front of me something you said, standard of care. I
Yeah.
just love that. That's
Yeah.
awesome. So,
And
and
other professions have that.
yeah,
They have clearly defined standard of care. And if they step outside of that,
yeah,
that's when the practitioner gets in trouble.
yeah.
It's not if they operate within it. And when they operate within it, that means that it's something that all practitioners do, and they know, and they believe, and they do it. And so when you step outside of that, then it's a problem.
Yeah, and it's so much better to have those conversations ahead of time. Before you face them. The more you can do that, of course, and educators can do that, then the better equipped they are to make those decisions, Robert, as you said earlier, just very, very quickly, because they've talked about it and can consider the what ifs and consider what they're feeling, what kind of decision they should make. Thank you.
Well, I'm about to tell you, I've been in meetings with both of you, and I'll have to say this, and I mean this honestly, but your commitment to the profession and your commitment to ensuring our students have the best learning environments and culture possible is outstanding. And so I appreciate your time today, and just having a model code of ethics in which teachers can be reflective, that benefits the students and continues to make a safer environment for our kids. And so Anne-Marie and Troy, I so appreciate you, and I appreciate your time, and I appreciate our listeners today. And if you can check out the web address that Anne-Marie had given us, and Anne-Marie, if you'd give that one more time.
I can do it. www.nasdaq.net, N-E-T. Go there, check it out.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. And this is Robert Brown on behalf of the Kentucky Valley Educational Cooperative. We will catch you on our next podcast.